Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Practical Christian Lessons. And today we are talking to Dr. Vic Reasoner about some of the issues that can pop up in Christian academia. Now, there will be important disclaimers there, but first, I think we should introduce Dr. Reasoner here. You have something to say real quick?
Well, I have pastored since 1976 and have been involved in a lot of extracurricular things, even serving as president of a small Bible college at one time. And so I am interested in training, teaching, and currently I'm an adjunct professor for 6 different institutions. I just stagger that where I'm trying to just teach for one institution at a time. And in many cases, I only teach one class for them. But that keeps a foot in the door and allows me to try to have some influence on the next generation.
Yeah. If anyone doesn't know what who Dr. Vic Reasoner is, he's been in the Wesleyan world for a long time. It's probably easier to say what you haven't done than what you have done. You've done everything. You've worked on the Armenian magazine. I remember that. Last count I had of your published books was over 50. I don't know if you've added to it since then, but very prolific.
I do have some new stuff up on Amazon.
Everybody go check out and go order the other 50 books while you're at it too. Be sure to add in there. But I think Dr. Vic Reasoner has a lot of credentials for this particular conversation, definitely far more than me. I've said this on the channel a few times. I am a seminarian, so I'm entering into this world, but I've already myself encountered a few problems. Now, before anyone jumps to assumptions and hears things that aren't being said, we're not saying all of academia has this problem. And at least I'm here today to learn and talk about specifically Christian academia, because we should be held to a different standard than the regular institution, mainly because we're all supposed to be following Christ. So that gives us some different metrics with which to be measuring ourselves. And we're not saying every Christian and every institution has the exact same problems, or the problems are as widespread. Some are worse, some are much better. You're going to get differences depending on where you are. And at my own school, I've encountered some issues, but most of my professors have been very great, very helpful, and not had these issues, and been very open, at least in private conversations, talking to me about some of these things. We really just have a few questions here to talk about, at least at the front. I think one of the most common things I've seen across institutions is the issue of compromise in the academic world. Right? In my Old Testament class, I remember the first 2 books we read. One of the 2, everyone loved. They thought it was great. It was good at introducing us to the topic, helping us learn. In my own personal studies, I studied a lot, but I could tell it was a good introduction and taught me things I hadn't necessarily studied before. And then one of the other textbooks, a lot of the other students and myself walked away from that textbook, and we thought, if someone wasn't very solid in their faith and they read this book, this might rock them out of the Christian faith because of how much ground it's conceding to scholarship, how many points it wasn't delving into, and more importantly, how it wasn't standing firm in its own defenses of a lot of things. The book was very focused on, here's what we can prove from extra biblical sources, and when the Bible came into contact with it, we now have to try and filter out these things. And for a lot of people, just the way they chose to try and go about that caused a lot of issues. I'm sure you've encountered other areas of compromise. I'm going to pass the mic over to you, sir.
Well, let me just react to this scenario that you've given. I think that we must first train our students in what is right before we introduce them to what's wrong. And so the first step is to be thoroughly trained in a biblical theology. That will help us detect what's false. But then at a master's level, and some of my courses are at a master's level, I do require my students to interact with other positions and other disciplines. But I think that has to be in a controlled atmosphere. And I'm going to use the analogy of an immunization. You know, many times in travel, I think I've gotten every shot that's been required that all over the world, and sometimes they're a live vaccine. You're getting a controlled amount of a
Yep.
deadly substance so that your body can build a resistance. Now, sometimes I require my students to read other points of view, but I think the issue, Josh, is um, we cannot educate and train the next generation just by raising questions. We've got to supply answers. But I want to prepare my students for the real world and what they're going to encounter out there. And so I will introduce things in a controlled atmosphere so that they can learn to think and work on their own. Now, even at some level, we have to allow students to think for themselves and to disagree. There is this cult-like training that is for propaganda purposes, and you simply they memorize the script, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's really not where we're at here. But I think the problem is when professors delight in throwing students off balance and raise more questions than they give answers. I remember telling a guy long ago when I was probably your age, hey, if you're going to tear down my house, you've got to help me build a better one. And I have had to tear some things down that I found that were wrong. And this problem can exist on both extremes, both the ultra conservative or ultra liberal. And so, an education, I think, needs to prepare the student for what's really out there. But see, the real issue, I think, is that the church requires a certain minimal education, and then, if I could just use this term, they sub that requirement out to an academic entity that is not necessarily committed to the same mission that the church is committed to. Now, so you see, part of the issue here is going to be that the academy must somehow be accountable to the church. And I'm not trying to be too restrictive here, but because some institutions are interdenominational. But the problem exists, I believe, when the church requires a degree and then the university or seminary provides that degree, but does not provide students that are adequately trained to do the work of the ministry.
Yeah. The reason I was just moving a bunch of things over is Kevin Watson, I know, talked about that a bit in his recent book, Doctrine, Spirit, and Discipline, where he noted, and this is something I've seen, and I do have other things, hopefully I don't forget them, and he noted, there's some times where movements in the church can start at a grassroots level, like, the Methodist revival started with the miners and the town people. And then there's times where it starts at the top and then works its way down. Mm-hmm. And I know, at least in American Methodism, Kevin Watson argues this, and I know the way you're talking sounds like you've seen some of this, where it starts at the top and then goes down, and we have these issues. I think that was probably spot on, and the biggest problem a lot of us had with the class. And what the teacher, it's not that the teacher wasn't open to answering questions. It just seemed that there were a lot of questions that were thrown out. Mm-hmm. And as you said, the foundation wasn't being built back up in the same way it was being torn down. And that does sound like something at least I've seen very early on and still going, and I've heard quite a bit about.
Most organizations grow out of revival. And then as they become institutionalized, the mission drift often comes through the educational entities. And I'm studying right now some of the same things Kevin has referred to in his book, but it looks to me like the Methodist Church took a wrong turn before 1900. Now, I know they've made some other wrong turns since then, but when you go back, one of the things that fascinates me is if I can pick one person. Now, there's a danger in picking on one person, but if one person epitomizes this transition, it may be Milton S. Terry, that taught at Garrett Theological Institute up near Chicago. And Terry is regarded as being a transitional figure in Methodism. He wrote his most famous book, Biblical Hermeneutics, in 1883. The second edition came out in 1885. But by the third edition, in 1890, and that's just a span of 5 to 7 years. By the third edition, he was wholesale taking out chapters of that book. The original book in the first two editions would have affirmed biblical inerrancy. But by the time you get to the end of his trajectory, I think in 1914, he was advocating higher criticism and actually even denied a literal second advent of Jesus Christ. And I'm looking at his life as a pivotal turning point in Methodist history, but he's the kind of guy who would say, oh, I really don't believe all this stuff, but we need to take it seriously. And as I look at his methodology, he tended to defend the liberal side. But then if you attack him for being a liberal, he'd say, oh, I don't necessarily believe all that. But I think we need to take it seriously. See, what's interesting, and we're reasoning now from particular cases to a general conclusion. That's always dangerous, but I don't want to overgeneralize. But I think that professors, in order to appear relevant or with it, tend to cut more slack for those who are more liberal than they are, than those who are more conservative than they are. It seems like that conservatism is a horse that we like to beat. And it sort of shows that we're not too far into fanaticism, or fundamentalism. That's the one thing you can't bear to be labeled. So we beat on that horse. But then we show how tolerant we are with the people on the other side. And Terry was a master at doing that without getting too embedded in that particular narrative. There was a fundamentalist Methodist preacher named Leander Munhall. And Munhall actually contributed 2 chapters into the Fundamentals, the classic series that came out. But those guys were at odds with each other, and Terry could bait Munhall. He could throw him a bone, and Munhall would attack it, and Terry would make him look foolish. But you see, what was happening, Terry believed that the Methodist Church could tolerate or imbibe some of this liberalism and it wouldn't hurt them. And we live on the other end of that experiment, and we know that it failed.
Yeah. I know I haven't encountered that with any of my professors, but I have seen it in my own, right. I read a lot. I love scholarship, but I have noticed that exact trend in quite a few authors. And that was a big issue in our first book. There was so much being conceded, and it just seemed like it was to seem as reasonable to the academic world as possible. And our professor did say that was one of the purposes in the writing of the book, was to try and tailor it to the more skeptical side of academia. But I know for me personally, I'm not saying this is your view, or anyone listening to this has to agree with me. When we're making concessions to try and win people over, it feels like we've entered into the ivory tower and are approaching everything the wrong way. Because these arguments don't convert people. The Spirit converts people. So conceding to the things they're already suppressing just seems like the wrong way to go about it. But,
Josh, in advanced studies, after the groundwork had been laid, there may be an appropriate place for you to evaluate a book like that, but certainly not out of the gate, certainly not when the foundation is still being laid. And I think sometimes these are unnecessary risks that need not be taken. If you'll allow me to close the loop on my last little dialogue about Terry and Munhall, by 1926, every Methodist seminary had declared their orientation as being liberal or modernist. 1926, that's 100 years ago. Yeah. But you see, this transition was taking place not in the camp meetings, and not at the conference level, not at the local level. It was at the institutional level. It was at the educational institutions. They all had capitulated in order to make the Methodist Church appear relevant in modern society.
Yeah. Something I want to do on each of these questions is I do want to talk about how you think we, both as students or anyone watching this, whether that's a preacher, minister of any kind, as someone in a pew, what do you think we should be trying to do when we see things like this happening, or how can we keep aware of? I don't expect everyone in a pew to keep up with the books every scholar's writing. They have jobs. Not everyone has the call to teaching and ministry where they need to be reading those. So how can we, at all levels, try to be educating ourselves? And then what can we do when we see things like this happening? What's the appropriate steps?
At the most basic level, parents ask people like myself and my colleagues, where is a safe place I can send my students? That's a hard question to answer sometimes. And I don't want to sound as though there are not any good options, but see, that's the basic level, is what is our priority? Is the priority of the institution to gain academic respectability among their peers, or do we have a fiduciary responsibility to parents and to local congregations that are trusting us to train the next generation of leaders? And so there has to be some kind of an accountability for institutions. I want to suggest to you, Josh, that one of the things that I think works against this is, in academia, a professor at some point is given tenure. And tenure means, if I can use this very loaded term, it's academic eternal security. In other words, instead of once saved, always saved, it's once a professor, always a professor, and you can't fire them for any breach of creedal confession. It's easier to point out the problem than it is to propose a solution. Yeah. When I was president of a small Bible college, we had no such thing as academic tenure, and every employee of the college signed a statement of faith annually, and that included me. Now, I don't know how that's going to work in every situation, but you see, the question is, what's more important, the academic model or the accountability model of the church? And if the church is expecting an institution to provide faithful biblical training, the institution needs to reciprocate with some degree of accountability.
Yeah, I fully agree there. And probably a hard battle to get things like that instituted. But that's a battle worth fighting for sure. The second question is how pushback is handled. So rather than a critique be levied at the work's errors, as one of my professors did, I should have asked him if I could have mentioned his name, so I'll abstain from mentioning him by name here. He did in a class we had where he did introduce a book that it was a history on, I'm forgetting his name, the civil rights movement. He was Charles Finney, okay, and other figures in the abolitionist movement and their large influence. But it was very clear from reading the book, it had a very liberal bent to it. And this was a later edition. The person who wrote one of the two introductions and then a little ending statement clearly said, there are some theological issues with Finney and some of these others. Some of the people in the story ended up becoming Unitarians as part of their abolitionist fight. And when the first thing we did when we sat down in class together is he said, I do not agree with everything in this book. It has some very serious errors. However, it is one of the few things that covers this history, and we need to be able to engage these things. And then he walked us through some of those issues, and that was wonderful. Of course, that was one of the higher level courses in it. It wasn't an introductory course anymore. It was like, I wish I'd had that in the beginning. But I've also had other professors who, when I've offered pushback, or I know Anthony Collins, we don't have to get into specific theological issues, but he's famously said in the past few years, the issue of inerrancy was settled in the 70s. And then his definition of inerrancy is like this almost cartoonish style view. I know John Oswalt mentioned recently in his interview with Jeffrey Rickman, he said that when you talk to the academics and the people on the ground, they're working with two different definitions of inerrancy.
Right. Yeah.
And I know like Jordan Cooper, Gavin Ortland, myself, right, we look at the Chicago statement and we go, that is a good definition of inerrancy. That is something to be worth holding on to. But whether it's that or other issues, some professors and academics, when you bring that up, they're like, oh no, that's done. We settled it. There's no more room for conversation here. And it's just like a door's being slammed shut. They don't want to allow any pushback on these things.
And so, Josh, the question is that consistent with the theological statement of the institution? And in some cases, Josh, the statement institutionally is the exact opposite. And the problem is, besides being disingenuous, you've got parents who are sacrificing, and you've got congregations who are trusting that institution to train the next generation of leaders, and they're actually a Pied Piper that's leading them down a different path.
Yeah. I remember that being one of our big issues. I didn't join my church until after they disaffiliated from the UMC, so I've technically never been part of it. But I remember I sat in on a lot of those conversations and looking at a lot of the things, and it was just like the official statements and confessions were fine. That's one of the things I appreciated when I was trying to discern where I'm going to enter into a denomination and find my new home after my season as a prodigal son. I found Methodism to be what I think is a very accurate and powerful representation of the Bible and the primitive church. But then when you looked at the actual practice and what people were allowing, there was constant straight out contradictions from the confessions. I remember reading statements from bishops that were like, we don't need to preach the resurrection, or the gospel needs to change with the times. And everyone wants to throw out different issues. It's like, this was the issue that settled it. But it really came down to people weren't holding scripture very highly. They weren't holding to the official teachings, and they were just constantly trying to undermine these things and then getting away with it because the people above them wouldn't hold them accountable.
Yes. So somehow there has to be accountability. There has to be transparency. And we need to know that we can trust the institutions that have the next generation of our leaders at their beck and call. I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, and you can edit this out if it doesn't fit in. But a guy named John West has written a book that just came out this year called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. And he is dealing with a phenomena in which a person is captured or kidnapped, and sometimes hostages develop a bond psychologically with their captors. So that's the Stockholm Syndrome. And he is applying that to what's happening in institutional churches, and says that American culture is collapsing because many of the leading influencers and professors identify more with the secular elites than they do with their fellow believers. And he is actually accusing this level of elitism of siding with the anti-Christian cultural captors on just about every moral issue. And so that expresses, that's just a paradigm that expresses this issue in which Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries are actually siding with the enemy on biblical authority, science, sexuality, and religious liberty. And the fact is, we can't trust some of our own institutions because they have been infiltrated. Now, the infiltration occurred because the institution wanted academic credibility, and so they hired the highest level PhDs they could get from Ivy League institutions, or even better, from European institutions. It seems like a European PhD trumps an American PhD, but in many cases, they're bringing that liberal, really, I'm going to call it a dead liberalism. Our culture has moved past that point, but the academia is still steeped in that. They're bringing that into what is supposed to be a conservative institution. And mind you, that these institutions were formed because the original institutions went bad.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing our own denominational institutions go bad in the same way through the same cause. They are importing liberal theology through their professors, and the professors sometimes almost have a missionary zeal, I think, to infect people with this higher level Christianity that as they see it. And so the reader or the listener might find this book enlightening. Stockholm Syndrome Christianity is just basically saying we've been captive so long in a pagan culture that now we're more concerned about pleasing the pagan culture than pleasing Jesus, who is the one who's to save us from that culture. I throw it into discussion kind of with a disclaimer for what it's worth. I think it's a paradigm that helps us understand these kinds of dynamics.
Yeah. That sounds like a lot of things I've seen constantly everywhere I've been looking. I know this was some time ago in between 1900 and now in Thomas Oden's autobiography. I remember one of his lines that it struck out to me the most. And I sort of went on a similar journey to his when I claimed to be a Christian, but I wasn't going to church. I wasn't really a Christian. I was just raised in it, had kind of fallen off the wagon in college. But he said that the hymns of our youth had been replaced with cries for social justice.
Mhm.
And, of course, we want to fight for the poor, the oppressed, the orphan, the widow, those Christ has called us to care for. But it can't come at the cost of the other things Christ has told
That's
us to
right.
hold true.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that and just like, I sat back in my seat. It was like I'd been sucker punched. That hit me so hard. And just off the top of my head, the only thing I can think to do to kind of address that would be to try and put people's feet to the fire and say, no, you have to allow these conversations. You can't just close the doors, because we're just going to keep going down the same trail that we've been going down for 100 years now.
Yes, at least. Now, of course, compromise, apostasy, has a history as long as mankind.
Yeah.
But we're talking about within the Methodist trajectory of the United States. I think we can say at least 100 years or more. And the fact that you brought up the name Thomas Oden, he said at one point, I think at the end of the second volume of his systematic theology, he says, I want the epitaph on my tombstone to say, this man had nothing new to say.
Yeah.
Because he said, if it's new, it's wrong. And that's an overstatement I'll address. But Jude verse 3 says that we are to contend for the faith that was delivered to us. And so the faith itself is not an evolutionary process that continues to change. But there are some things that are eternal truth, and those are non-negotiable. And so in that sense, you see, what that pushes up against, Josh, is that an institution requires their professors to publish.
Yeah.
It's publish or perish. And you have to publish to make a name for yourself. The easiest way to make a name for yourself is to say something that no one has ever said before. And if you do so, you're probably going to be a heretic or some, in the process. But there are those who feel the pressure to speak to this moment and to get their name on a book spine. And the problem is, we need to be defending the faith, not trying to tinker with it and change it to fit our cultural norms. Now, the only part of Odin that I think he would agree with me here is no classic theology is going to deal with such issues as transgender dysphoria, critical race theory, social justice, and some of those things. You can't go back to the classics, but what we would say is that the Bible and biblical principles gives us something to judge and gauge these new questions by. And so, yes, we need to be writing. We need to be addressing our culture because there are new questions. But we don't need a new book, or we don't need to change the authority of the church to keep up with the times. It's we make application. We work from that which is settled to that which is not settled. And the scripture says that the word of God is forever settled in heaven. Unfortunately, it's not on a lot of seminary campuses. And so we have, everything is in flux.
Yeah.
And people are sick of that. People want answers. And if we don't give them a biblical answer, somebody's going to give them a wrong answer.
Yeah.
But we work from what is settled. And there can be disagreement on some of the application. And we're working through with artificial intelligence, for example. There's some moral and ethical questions that There's a type of person, Josh, that can express mature opinions on questions they've never encountered before. They're an instant expert. I don't want to be that.
Yeah.
If you affirm biblical authority, I affirm biblical authority, and we're applying that to artificial intelligence, we can agree to disagree on some things.
Yeah.
There doesn't have to be this lockstep agreement. But I do think that if we don't agree on what our ultimate and final authority is, then we're chasing each other around the barn and nobody knows anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that does seem to be a big problem in a lot of conversations. I'm not just in the academic world, in general, is I've seen people who will just talk past each other constantly because they're arguing from a different foundation and they never discussed that foundation. And I mean, family's family, but that can lead to some of the biggest drag down fights that I've seen is when people are using the same terms but not using them in the same way and coming from entirely different places to how they got there.
Well, I think it's good for us to have civil discourse, but
Yes.
you're referring to uncivil discourse.
Yes.
And that doesn't do anybody any good.
There's a joke that the 11th commandment of Methodism is be nice. And it's because there's so many times where everyone's just so focused on being nice that they never say anything controversial. They don't want to hurt someone's feelings, so maybe they'll hold back. Right. And part of mature discourse, in my experiences, is when you can take off the kid's glove and not be nice. That doesn't give you room to be hateful, right? Yes. To break things like Galatians 5:22 through 26, where show each other charity and love. But sometimes you do need to say things in a more stern way, in a little more plain way. And that shouldn't be a problem unless you have this weird idea of niceness in the back of your head dictating how you handle your discourses.
Yeah, in Ephesians, we're told to speak the truth in love.
Yeah.
And half the world speaks the truth, and the other half is committed to love. But we need to marry those two things together. Yeah. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do to a child, do in response to a child, is drop that, get away, back off. Yeah. They're going to hurt themselves. And that is speaking the truth in love. Now, at a more adult level, I think sometimes we do need to name names, but the issue is I'm not attacking the person. In other words, I'm not making fun of how big his ears are, for instance, or mocking him or her in some way. But I think sometimes we need to warn people that certain things are dangerous and have consequences. And I think there are people who don't think you ought to even denounce the devil. They're so polite, they won't renounce even the devil. And that's a good virtue gone too far. There is an illiterate Kentucky evangelist by the name of William Branham that died a long time ago, but he's got more followers today than he's ever had. There's over 2 million people that follow the teachings of this guy. And the academic community doesn't have any awareness because he never wrote a book, obviously. But his videos and teachings go on, and there's a lot of people who are misled and actually have imbibed racist views that have been extracted from the scripture, but not properly, mishandled. And I think it's appropriate. See, I'm not going to make fun of him as a person, but I think it's appropriate for us to talk about the influence. There are influencers in our culture today, and I watch those people, and I'm sure you do too. And sometimes as a pastor, I told a lady one time to quit going to Benny Hinn crusades. She got, every time she came home, she was confused. It took me too long to have to detox her from those things. Now, You know, you can edit that out if that's inappropriate, but I think it's an example. I'm not making fun of him as a person, but I'm saying there are people who are teaching deadly doctrines,
Mhm.
and that's why we have to be equipped to know what really matters, what's worth fighting over, and what's not.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I won't edit it out because that's gold. And I think something that a lot of people listening to this probably need to think about. Of course, I do a lot of online ministry. I work with which means I work with a lot of younger people.
Mhm.
Um, and something I've noticed in a lot of online spheres is everyone tries to treat everyone the exact same way, which can fall apart quickly. Like, we don't treat a wolf in sheep's clothing the same way we do as the random atheist on the street. They're
Mhm.
not coming from the same place. They're not trying to do the same things most of the time. And learning, trying to discern, right, when is the right time to be like Elijah and say, where is your God? Is he
Mhm.
on the toilet? Is he going to trip when he tries to get up
Yeah.
and come here?
Uh-huh.
Or like Jesus telling the Pharisees in one setting, you brood of vipers, or woe
Yeah.
to you, you are an
Yeah.
unwashed tomb.
Yeah.
And then at other times being like, you need to go reflect on this scripture, and
Yes.
being much more
Mhm.
gentle in some scenes. Of course, that just comes with discernment and experience and time. That's a
Mhm.
skill you have to sort of learn in the field.
Well, Josh, there are people who look for a good fight, and
Yeah.
I think they need a deeper work of grace. I think um, I don't look for a fight.
Yeah.
I don't relish a fight, but sometimes I feel this push, and I know that the Lord is telling me you're going to have to speak up, and sooner or later I do. Now, because I brought the Lord into the equation here, I'm not blaming him for what I say. I might have could have said it better. I might could have come at it from a different angle. I'm not pleading that because God told me that I have no accountability, but I think a person who is called to ministry sometimes feels that compunction. I have to warn people, and it's not anything we enjoy. I've had to call some people down. As a pastor, I've had to tell some people to sit down and be quiet. Um, but in 50 years of ministry, it only happened once or twice. It's not something that I relish.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that I grew up in a very authoritative age, and we've reacted and overreacted to where anything goes. Oh, I don't want to hurt their feelings. Well, there's got to be this balance, and we're always struggling and coming to God and saying, "Am I am I striking the right balance here?" Um, and I think as long as a person is asking that question, they're not too dangerous. But I'm concerned about an academic community that's totally cut off from this and is really more interested in impressing their peers than they are influencing their students.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that as a concern. I wouldn't attach any name to that because that would be an accusation. I don't know their heart. But I do think that the danger in 1 Corinthians 8:1, or knowledge puffs up, but love builds up.
Yeah.
And the danger in the academic community is I've taken a position as the number one Wesleyan theologian, and I dare anyone to contradict me. And if you do, I've got to defend my turf.
Yeah.
Um, that kind of a person needs to get right with the Lord.
Yeah. That ties nicely into the third point. Is I put it down as too much focus on the faithful. I think I'll workshop that here while we're talking, but pride is definitely one of man's most natural sins. And I get it. I am academically minded. I'm a naturally prideful person. That's why I love
Mhm.
my wife so much. She helps keeps me in check. I'm sure
Mhm.
you and your wife and your kids help keep each other in plenty of check. If anyone doesn't know, Vic Reasoner is blessed with a very full quiver and a very full quiver of grandchildren.
Yes.
But it's so easy to fall into those things because, you know, when people give you praise for your work, good or bad, you're like, that feels good. That plays to our natural desires. You know, who doesn't like to hear, hey, you did a wonderful job? But I've just found in a lot of my own readings and working through academic spheres, a lot of the focus seems to be more towards the unfaithful than to the faithful. And I know, as you said, right, they have to write papers to publish. Anyone doesn't know how that works in the academic world, I'll have some videos pinned below in a comment. But, you know, as you said, publish or die, that's very much the case. The more you write, the more of a name you have, the more money you'll get, the more grants you get. Your livelihood literally depends on writing papers. And
you lift your institution up. Your institution, you are the face then of your institution.
Yep. Yeah. So there's every incentive to be doing that, which means you need to gear your papers and such to who you're writing to, because, you know, not everyone's going to read the 10th paper this year on John Wesley's doctrine of evangelical conversion, for example. It's a big thing in the Methodist circles, but they might read the 3rd paper that's this new view on how to approach this passage in Scripture, even if it's completely heretical and wrong, just because it's new and exciting. And I understand this impulse, but I think we have to do our best, as you were talking about, right? We have to keep on the truth and be aware of our biases. We have to know that a lot of these people that those articles and such are geared to, their hearts are stone, their eyes are covered over. But the people that are going into these institutions, the people who are, well, one, paying for an education, but two, these are the people who are going to be going out into churches or prisons, if they're chaplains, or hospitals, things like this, and caring for people's souls and being the ones to guide and shepherd them towards the future, which is rightfully said in James, you know, you will be held to a higher standard, which should fear us with some fear and trembling there. But I think there's just been this loss of focus there on what the goal is. And I'm not sure what the right answer to that is, or what the right way to be trying to push people towards being aware of that is.
Yeah, and Josh, basically the institutions that we can trust is based on their track record, is based on their output. But I heard this, that the best registered nurse is the one who got a C average. And this only applies in a certain limited sense. But there are those who are so academically minded. They're the A student. They get all of the technical part, but don't have the bedside manner. And so what they were saying is that, yes, that you have to have a certain amount of information, but you've got to have that relational part. And so when we come to the academy, when we come to theology, sometimes what the institution does is produces more academicians, that it produces more scholars. Well, we need people at that level, but not a whole bunch. We really need, and every denomination has a shortage of pastors. And I'm not saying that's the only ministry, but I'm talking about relational ministry. Sometimes it's not the student who can think in all of these abstract philosophical concepts that makes the best minister. And I think that probably the professor is a very above average individual, and maybe year after year after year they get bored with the same repetition. And every now and then there's a student that shows promise. There's a spark. There's this intellectual connection. And if we're not careful, we train more people to become intellectual specialists like ourselves. There has to be a passion in in the basics of the Christian faith. And if I haven't said anything controversial enough up to this point, Josh, sometimes I listen to some of this academic bantering and want to just say it's not that complicated.
I feel you there.
Yeah.
That does feel like a lot of my conversations. Of course, my generation and the next generation are, notorious for our shorter attention spans than those who came before. But I've noticed that in my work, people, I work with a lot of people who have a lot of anxiety, but once their anxiety is resolved, it seems like they go on these moods of, oh, I really want to talk about this specific thing. And if they would put what they wrote in comments or on random social media posts, they could have whole books written with how much they've talked about some of these things and how deep they try to get into it and how viciously they'll at times fight for it. And I'm like, it's not that hard. I'm definitely going to memorize it. Passion for the basics of the Christian faith. I think that is perfect and something that we all need to try and keep ourselves grounded on. That's one of the things that I haven't used that phrasing, but one of the things I do to try and keep my pride in check is read things like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, or some of the newer things that have come out from Seedbed, like the absolute basics of the Christian faith, or Timothy Tennett's This We Believe. It's just once a year, maybe more, return to those things and go through them and be like, all these textbooks I read, all these conversations I have, at the end of the day, those really aren't going to matter like teaching someone these things right here, and how much more life these will give us, how much more life we'll find resting on Christ and the promises and the basics than we will delving into these deep theological grounds. Not that that's not important, but as you said, we have to keep a passion for those basics. It's wonderful. Is there anything else you want to sort of talk about here, or other issues you've noticed that I haven't brought up here? As I said, I've had a much more limited exposure to a lot of this than you and many of the other professors I've talked to have.
No, I think it's good to quit while we're ahead. And maybe I have a short attention span along with some of the others. But really, I think we have to look at what is the purpose of the institution. I'm on an institutional board right now, and we meet monthly, and we read our missional statement together every month, just to remind us of why we're doing what we're doing. And it's almost inevitable that with the passing of generation, the passing of leadership batons, that there are shifts. Not all shifts are bad, but we need, if I can make a shift to be more biblical, more Christ-like, more relevant, that's one thing. But we are concerned when institutions that we've trusted in the past are shaky. And, yes, we need to allow for discourse. We need to allow for people to process. But on the basic non-negotiable doctrines of Scripture, we need to nail them down and glue them down and nail them down again. And we don't want students to leave with more questions than answers on those primary doctrines. Typically and statistically, students have more faith before they enter the seminary than they do after they graduate. And that is academic malpractice. Yeah,
I fully agree, and I think that's a good spot to end it. Is
right.
That somber warning right there. So with that, everybody, go in peace. Have a wonderful day. God bless.